Awesome. Welcome to Robots of Red Tape. I'm your host, Nick Shutt. Really happy to have my friend Rich Hyman here with us today. Rich, how you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks for the invite.
Dude, thank you for coming, man. I really appreciate it. I know I've been chasing you to be a guest here for a while. Man, if you don't mind, would you just kind of tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, your career, and how you got here?
Sure. Yeah, so formally, my background formally is in statistics, so it's not machine learning or artificial intelligence, which I think colors kind of my interpretation of artificial intelligence to a sufficient degree. And I think that comes mainly from the fact that statistics is entirely applied. Like there are no external goals for statistical models. There's no notion of having a statistical model that understands the problem it's working on or that is intelligent. There are no like grandiose goals of AGI. And so coming into machine learning about 15 years ago and then kind of subtly being introduced to artificial intelligence, these were all things that I just thought were kind of I almost want to say goofy, but were certainly surprising. Like I didn't understand exactly where these things were coming from. I ended up writing a book in so machine learning for the last 15 years. After doing that for a number of years, I ended up taking a sabbatical of sorts from a cybersecurity company that I was working on, where I was a chief AI officer, I think at that point. But I was, that even that designation was kind of was still something I struggled with. Like, what is AI? And so I took a sabbatical of sorts and started sort of diving into the topic more comprehensively. I ended up writing a book in 2021 called Doing AI, and it was sort of a critique of solution-centric kind of strategies. At that time, a lot of people were talking about and advocating so-called AI first strategies. And, coming from a stats background, I thought that was kind of weird. And so the book was really trying to tackle some of the hype around AI at that time, and specifically this idea of solution centric kind of problem solving. And and so I guess it was kind of like a dogmatic treatment of problem solving and like how it's really important to put problems before solutions. Um, so that was 2021. The following year, ChatGPT was released, and I had done some work in natural language processing. Actually, the first book I wrote was about natural language processing, specifically on sentiment analysis. And so I was following NLP somewhat, despite like working in cybersecurity for most of the last 10 years. And so I was excited about it. I thought it was really good. I know from experience working with those models, like capturing the long-term dependencies between different concepts in language was something that these models really struggled with. And so I thought it was a breakthrough, quite honestly. And I was trying to get my arms around it. At that time, I was also talking to a friend of mine. Um, who is a lawyer working at kind of the intersection of privacy, machine learning, and I guess business. And we were discussing language models and what they were trained on and how that might complicate the adoption of the technology. They're trained on the internet. Of course,
Mhm.
the internet contains a lot of intellectual property, copyrighted materials, etc. And so he was interested, certainly, and I was interested in getting his perspective, and we started to sort of, I guess, collaborate. And we had entertained the notion of an article that kind of bloomed into a book that we published last year. And that was like kind of our just initial assessment of the technology. We decided this year that we had spent, the book was published. This book was called More Than You Asked For, was published last June or July. We spent all of last year working with the technology. And so we came back to the book early this year, and that book, More Than You Asked For, was kind of a light treatment. I think it was about 20 or 25,000 words. And so we thought we would do a comprehensive sort of examination of the technology and what it was and what it wasn't, and ultimately like the complications of adoption, or even the complication of not adopting
Mhm.
the technology. And so that led to the book that's coming out in the next couple of days, actually, and it's titled Generative Artificial Intelligence Revealed. It has a long subtitle. I forget what
Mhm.
that is exactly. Let me get it for the benefit of your viewers.
Absolutely. Uh,
Yeah, actually, I don't even have it up.
it's
Okay,
okay. I do understanding AI from technical depth to business insights to responsible adoption.
you've got it. Thank you.
Ah, man, I'm listen, I'm here to help, Rich, truthfully.
Yes, yes, I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I appreciate your background and I appreciate, kind of a little summary of how you got here. Why, obviously you've written a couple of books. This is your third one, correct? Or is it your fourth? Your fourth book. Um, what inspired you to write this one specifically? And what, kind of what questions did you want to answer that you didn't answer in the last books?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so we didn't have to come back to this one. And we obviously we kind of we didn't discuss a lot of things that should be discussed, especially if you're a business leader and you're thinking about adopting the technology. So there were obvious ways to improve the book, but I don't think that would have been enough to like motivate me to write a book because writing sucks. It takes a lot
Mhm,
of time. It's nights and weekends, like you're not doing anything for a period of time, and pulling this one together was pretty fast, but it's 5 months of working every day, nights and weekends, 70-hour weeks. It's a lot of work, and rewriting especially is tedious. I think the specific thing that kind of motivated me, especially to re-examine the topic, was that, when I wrote Doing AI in 2021, there was a lot of hype. And so that was kind of like my attempt to make sense of this narrative. What I think has surprised me this year is that, we're 20 approximately 20 months from the release of ChatGPT. It hasn't been a lot of time, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of users of the technology. It's gone mainstream to some degree. Like all of my work in statistical modeling and machine learning, like nobody's really understood that. It's never been mainstream. It's kind of always been behind the scenes. And now you've got like my mother is using ChatGPT. She's asking me questions about it. It has gone mainstream.
mhm,
Despite that, there's a lot of skepticism. And so I think why I wanted to write this book especially is because there are these conflicting narratives. There's certainly like the people on one side who are hyping the technology. They're a little disingenuous at times. Some of them, like the effective acceleration group, I don't know how familiar you are with like the narratives in AI, but effective acceleration believes like innovation is all we need, and I think innovation is important. Economic benefits from technology and productivity gains, potential productivity gains are important. But on the other side, there are like these AI doomers, and they talk about X risk, existential risk. They talk about P doom, the probability of like doom, and they seem to me to be largely unhinged. Like they're
mhm,
not looking at the statistical models for what they actually are. They're creating these like fantastic kind of thought experiments of what the technology could be. Then you have another group, the skeptics, who are like, I don't know how closely you followed this, but like Sequoia recently wrote an article about like the $600 billion question, where's the revenue? But they're creating kind of like these artificial timelines of how quickly companies should generate revenue. Keeping in mind we're only about 20 months from ChatGPT moment. So there's just a lot of confusion. And I think just generally speaking, we live in a society that's increasingly polarized. We can't like come to terms with almost anything nowadays.
mhm,
And so I just sense that some of these anxieties are real, but some of them are just artificial creations from like various groups kind of pushing their own narrative. And so the book was certainly a tech kind of like that's the grant The verbose subtitle is why the reason why it's so verbose is because there are like these technical considerations. We talk about the technology, we talk about practical implications, but we also are trying to like wrestle with all of these different narratives that surround the technology now.
Hmm.
And I think that's what like kind of motivated me. It wasn't just like the technical considerations of the technology. It was that organizations, I think, are feeling a little overwhelmed and confused and anxious, and they're
Hmm.
just trying to make sense of what is already very inscrutable technology, but it's also within this like societal envelope that I think has really complicated things.
Hmm. No, I completely agree with you. And yeah, I've been to a lot of events over the last couple of, last 6 months to a year on AI, because everybody's doing an event on AI. How is AI going to help you with this? How it like, whether it's writing or, or coding or, whatever, everybody wants to talk about how AI is changing things. And, I completely agree with you that first it's incredible. Like it's this technical subject matter is dense for a lot of people, I think, first. Like folks that are not like yourself with the mathematical statistical backgrounds, for it seems like magic to a lot of folks.
For sure.
Um, and second, I also agree with you, and I like I think like I mentioned just before we started today, the reasons that you wrote the book are largely a lot of the reasons why I started Robots and Red Tape is that there's a lot of people out there that have a lot to gain by getting people to believe certain things about AI first. And then second, there's a lot of people out there that are trying to, put that would like it if we could put it, put things back in Pandora's box, right? But that's not how this works.
For sure.
That's just not it's not feasible to kind of roll back. And one of the things that interestingly that I hear a lot of like questions wise at these events from people is how is AI going to take my job and what is it going to do to like how am I going to be displaced and negatively impacted? Because I think when you look at the rate of change over the last 50 years and its acceleration and continued acceleration, that adds to the uneasiness of society. And I think that could be part of why we're so divided and why there's been such a cultural backlash against other, and in a lot of different ways from a lot of different arenas. And so I love why you wrote it, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Hmm.
Yeah, salient observations. Yeah, I've made similar observations. I think the rate of change, yeah, it has increased.
Hmm.
But I think change itself just causes people to become anxious. And
Yeah.
like, we're some of like I went to college right when the internet started to take off. Now there are people that after me have been born after me who have just always lived with the internet.
Hmm.
And so but specifically they've only known the internet as being like one thing. And now language models appear to be on the verge of like disrupting what the internet is. Like we have created content to get advertisers to kind of like point their algorithm at us so we get page views in return, they get advertising dollars. Like there's been this really we kind of understood the mechanics of the internet for
Hmm.
a long time, and language models could potentially subvert that like whole paradigm.
Hmm.
Google itself could be different, like that is just part of our lingua franca. Like everybody
Yeah.
talks about Googling things. Now are you going to chat GPT things, or are you going to
Hmm.
like, and so I guess my point is there's change on the horizon. I just
Yeah.
think that is part of it. Like it's
Hmm.
just found like we as people are just foundationally uneasy with change.
Yeah.
And some
Yeah.
of it's going to be good and some of it's going to be bad. I'm not one of these guys who are like all on the camp of it's going to be great, don't worry about anything. But I'm also not on the other side, which is it's going to be doom and gloom and you don't
Hmm.
get your umbrella out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think from an evolutionary perspective, we are wired to have a certain reaction to change,
right.
right? Because that like it's different and different, like our
A
brain,
negative one.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's not like I think the thing that we are most scared of as a species is change, period, right? And one of the things that blows my mind is when you think back, like somebody that lived 150 years ago, their day-to-day life had more in common with somebody that lived 1,000 years before them than with us today.
Yeah.
And we didn't evolve to adapt with this level of this rate of change, right? And I think that I mean, it's just going to continue, and it's going to continue to accelerate, right? Over the next, I mean, that's how exponential growth works.
Yeah, well, I'm suspicious of exponential growth in the real world, but what your point about the like you could have grown up, a few hundred years ago in an agrarian society, and you might see very little change. Like the corn looked the same, the agri,
Mhm,
the tools that you used for agriculture largely looked the same. Like you didn't travel like the world didn't change in your lifetime significantly. And now, I think we are seeing more change inside of
mhm,
people's lifetime. The internet, the internet, I'm trying to give as hopefully an illustrative example of like just that, like trying to wrestle with, oh, th this thing that I've grown up with, and it's been a utility for me for a long time, now will probably look different. And
mhm.
that change, well, I'm losing something, like
Yeah.
people look at it effectively as I'm losing something, not that I'm gaining something new with new functionality.
Mhm.
It's that change means I'm losing something. And I
Yeah.
think that inherently causes anxiety.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. I agree. And so, I know you touched on this in your book, but when you start thinking about, generative AI models, why is it so complex to train some of them or just train them in general? And what in your experience, what are some of the common challenges that both like businesses and then government agencies face as they look to train their models?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, to some degree, the GPT model is trying to ameliorate this problem, right? Like they come pre-trained for
Mhm,
people who don't know that. Like when you download a language model, it's effectively already like compressed the training data into the model parameters, and you can choose to just use that model as is, right? Like you can
mhm,
just run it in inference to answer any questions you want. For those organizations who aren't satisfied with like that pre-training, they may want something a little more domain specific, or they may have corporate data that they want to use to train the model. I think the complication that most organizations face is really that one is cost. Like the models are very large, and like especially over the last number of years, there have been sort of these scaling laws, and the general observation has been that we can scale these models, we can make them bigger, we could add more data, and that generally leads to better improvement. And that's driven a lot of the innovation in the field. As a consequence of that is, they take a long time. They take specialized hardware to train. They take a long time to train. It costs a lot of money. And so that's an obstacle in and of itself, but it's complicated by the fact that these scaling laws have changed a lot too. There have been the Kaplan scaling laws, the chinchilla scaling laws, now the llama scaling laws, and like it's more of an art than a science. Like there's this kind of like abstract concept of scaling laws, and bigger more or less means better. But the specifics of it, when you actually get down to like, oh, okay, I want to train this model or retrain this model, it's wanting, right? Like there's still some complexities there that are being figured out. At the cost and the margin for error is really big. And
mhm,
so actually Bloomberg wrote a really interesting paper about a year and a half ago on their experience training a language model on their corporate data. And they had I think it was a 50% kind of like margin of error. So they had a compute budget. I think it was 500, I think it was maybe $1 million. And they were expecting to probably waste half of that money on the training. That means like they would probably have to retrain the model multiple times to get the kind of performance that they wanted. And so I think that's the obstacle that a lot of organizations are dealing with. And why frontier models like Gemini, Google's model, or Anthropic's model, Claude, or OpenAI, obviously OpenAI's models, is so attractive to many businesses because all of that cost is gone, all of the complexities of training are gone. You could just download the model and you could get started. And unless you have like a bunch of corporate data or you have like a use case that's super high value and you know that you need to train a model to get like the 10x or 100x kind of returns, I
Mhm.
think it's a very risky strategy. The Bloomberg strategy, that is training from scratch, is a very risky strategy.
Mhm. Yeah, I was gonna as I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, why would somebody train their own model versus use somebody like a one of these large language models, whether it be Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, and put a RAG on top with
Sure.
your own data? I mean, is that like just kind of a workaround, or is
That's a
that
workaround.
okay?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So, yeah, if you are working in a domain that's specialized and it's
Mhm.
not well represented in the training data of these like foundational models, then you have to figure out a way to get that information, that external knowledge to the model.
Mhm.
And you do that, a couple of ways. One is prompt engineering. You basically pack all the information that you can inside of your prompt. That was a little more challenging a year or two ago. It's become a lot easier because these context windows, basically how much information you could fit into the prompt, has increased in size. One way to kind of like mitigate the constraints of the prompt window is to use RAG systems, but
Mhm.
they're conceptually the same thing. It's trying to get external knowledge to the model so the model doesn't have to depend so heavily on its training data.
Mhm. Okay. So you mentioned, and I know you mentioned scaling laws, and I mean that's a term I'm not super familiar with. Could you define that for me?
That's, I mean, they're yeah, I don't know if there's a formal definition. In fact, the law itself has taken on a couple of like interpretations over the last couple of years. It generally means kind of like two things simultaneously. One is that by making a model larger and training it on more data, you're generally going to see better performance. So the model is going to have improved performance. And this is because, to some degree, the model just has more capacity. So it's got the ability to memorize more of the training data. That extra capacity also allows it to kind of learn a lot of like tail knowledge. And so you could think about like a small model as kind of a library. And if it's a small library, you're gonna have the most popular books
Mhm.
for your customers. If it's a really large library, you're gonna have like the most popular books available to them, but you're
Mhm.
also gonna have like those rare sort of like niche books
Mhm.
for specialized readers. And larger models are kind of analogous to just a larger library. They've just got more capacity to remember tail knowledge.
Mhm.
The related idea is that the internet was never designed to train language models.
No.
And so there is a lot of problematic content, toxic content, sexist materials, racist materials. There are also yeah, let's just limit it to just like problematic content. And so, this is noisy information. And so the other idea of scale kind of suggests that at scale, that noise kind of washes away.
Mm.
And so that's maybe another motivation of using just like really large models is it washes out some of the noise.
Okay. No, I appreciate that, no, it makes a lot of sense as you explain it. By the amount of information that's going into the system, kind of. it can improve the overall performance. And dovetailing into my next my next question is, I would also assume probably does a better job, or I would assume the margin for error and the number of hallucinations are going to be smaller with the more data you have. Uh, or is that my ignorance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I've ever seen somebody look at that question. Um, it's conceivable from the perspective of memorization. Larger models will memorize more of the training data, assuming the training data is representing accurately representing ground truth. You could imagine, conceptually at least, that it would hallucinate less. The ability for it to capture tail knowledge also, or at least conceptually, I think suggests that scale does positively impact the degree or the frequency of hallucinations. I can't say absolutely whether that's true. I mean, RAG systems and prompt engineering also, at least conceptually, impacts hallucinations. In fact, I'm almost certain I've read papers that have looked at this empirically, and prompt engineering, good prompt engineering and RAG systems do impact it, perhaps reinforcing the idea that larger models might also perform better on hallucinations. But it's certainly not something that you can eliminate entirely. I mean, it's still kind of a bug. It's a congenital defect of the models themselves. Because I mean, the goal of these models ideally would be that they aren't memorizing the training data, or they're not kind of doing approximate information retrieval. They are actually generalizing from the training data. That's kind of a tenuous proposition. But hallucinations are really the model kind of generalizing from the training data. When that training data, like whatever task you're working on, is underrepresented in the training data, I think that's when the generalization gets really tenuous, and um, you have I think a larger propensity for the models to hallucinate. And the way I like to intuitively explain this is, if you go to Google and you search for something and you get no results, or you get like 10 results or 100 results, that kind of search query
Hmm.
represents something that is underrepresented on the internet. And language models, since they're trained on the internet, they kind of behave in a very similar way. And so those questions or queries or tasks might be the same kind of thing where language models struggle and may hallucinate.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. And how can you mitigate some of those hallucinations, and how and when, outside of not enough like underlying training data, what are some of the other some of the other times that they do occur, and how can we mitigate that?
Yeah, you could try to create data, so you can retrain a model. You could fine tune. You can't Fine tuning doesn't really impact hallucinations that much. You could conceivably like generate some synthetic data for those parts of the training data that are underrepresented, or find new data. It doesn't have to be synthetic data, but you could retrain the model with that data so it doesn't struggle as much. I think prompt engineering and RAG are like two obvious strategies too, where you could try to impact the hallucinations.
Hmm.
Uh, Yes, it's still a congenital defect of these models though. And
Yeah.
so I think I've read a couple of papers that look at like these metacognitive kind of like prompting strategies, and it's basically asking the model to kind of evaluate the model's output. And it's kind of like this, I want you to like reflect upon what you've just generated. And sometimes that works. I mean, it helps. It certainly helps. It doesn't solve the problem, but in those scenarios, you're asking the model to basically evaluate the output of a model, and that may be another model, or it could be the same model, but sometimes that could catch hallucinations as well.
Hmm. Yeah, something that I have found utilizing these models, the one I mean, I use ChatGPT more than any of the other ones out there. I
Yeah.
found that it's overly verbose, right? It uses like 75% too many words in most of the situations, right? Yeah, I was always taught and and believe in and have like the art of good writing is using the fewest number of words that you need to get your point across,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And that's not what these models excel at.
No. Yeah, their recall is uncanny,
Mhm.
which means that at times they know they don't shut up.
Yeah. And so whenever I get an answer back from them, because so, first anything that I'm creating, I always like go back and rewrite it and edit it and rework it.
Yeah,
The amount I do that will entirely depend on how important what I'm creating is. But one of the strategies that I personally always like is I tell it whenever it writes something I tell it rewrite that and use 50% less words, right?
yeah,
And then it will become far more concise and closer to usable, but it's also not so overly wordy. I found that you have to think to get to the point of what was trying to say, because I'm just using that as a base to rewrite and to I'm using that as a base for something that I'm writing anyway.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, I'm totally with you. Yeah, the recall is uncanny. Sometimes it's annoying and you
Hmm.
just wish it would be a little more judicious with like the language it's using, but it
Hmm.
doesn't know. It doesn't know any better. It
Right.
doesn't know really when it starts with its reply. It doesn't even know how it's going to end, which is I think it's not how people intuitively think that models work. Like they figured it all out and they're replying to me. It's no, they're kind of like figuring it out on the fly. And so they will kind of like sometimes recapitulate aspects of it. Um, Famously or infamously, Sam Altman shared his system prompt. I don't know if you're familiar with system prompts, but in ChatGPT, you could go into your settings and establish a system prompt. And it's just basically like who you are, because the like personification of the models is really important. Like
Hmm.
what you want the model to do is answer the question for you. And so if the model has some information about who you are and the kind of questions you like from the perspective that you're interested in pursuing, it does a better job at creating content. Um, Altman's CEO of OpenAI, right? His system prompt was based, I forget what it was, but it was something effectively like be concise,
Hmm.
which I think is a bad strategy for the model. You certainly don't want it to be terse on the onset. Like it's almost better, at least this is kind of like my intuition. It's
Hmm.
good for the model to be verbose up front and then you compress afterwards. Because what the language model is doing with that information is it's you're kind of like navigating its internal representation. You're kind of like going through a maze. And the more words models generate and the more words you give it, the easier it is to like navigate that internal sort of the internal representations of the models. And but telling it to be, telling it to be concise doesn't do you any favors.
Hmm.
Um, so what I usually tell people to do is, let it use the default behavior. It's chatty. You want it to shut up most of the times, but let it do that work. And then downstream, like once you're satisfied with whatever like work product it's produced, is
Hmm.
then ask it to like compress it, like
Hmm.
whatever it looks like to you, make me bullet points, reduce the amount of
Yeah.
text by 50%.
Mhm.
And generally that leads to better performance.
Mhm. Oh, I'm glad I accidentally stumbled upon it. And yeah, I do like what you said about how it never knows where it's going
Yeah.
when it starts. Because I'm not gonna lie to you, Rich. That's most sentences that I come up with. I have no idea where we're gonna end. My mouth is taking us on a journey. We're all gonna get there together at the same time, right?
Right.
It's how I've gotten in trouble with things that I've said over the years. You know.
That's
So
a dangerous strategy.
hey man, listen, it's been working. It's been working
Yeah.
so far, mostly, I think. So what man, as you think about some of these, these I know we've talked a lot about general and large language models and as you contrast some of those, I know you brought up Bloomberg earlier versus like the domain specific or smaller models. Yeah, how can you like what's the performance difference there? What are the upsides and the downsides to both?
Yeah, I mean, bigger usually beats smaller.
Mhm,
The scaling laws have changed a lot, and so now we are training somewhat smaller models with more data. And that's like, early on, what like the basically like the ratio of tokens to parameters were pretty low. You would
mhm,
have maybe one token, which is just a token is a partial word. You could think of it as a whole word for training a language model. And you might have like a few parameters, and a parameter is just the parameter of the model is actually the thing that gets adjusted during training, and they're just weights of the model. But now, like, you have, I mean, one to, let's say, two or three, a token to a parameter, early days scaling laws. Then it went, from a token to a bunch of parameters. Now you have, like, for every token, you might have, hundreds of tokens. And so they've what I guess, like, the general observation is that it's still bigger is still better, but now we're training smaller models on more data. And so it's still more compute overall,
mhm.
but there's been kind of a shift.
Yeah.
We'll see if that holds or what that looks like with GPT-5. There's some speculation that that's going to be like a multi-trillion parameter model. Um,
Okay.
um,
That's incredible.
but but generally speaking, size still matters. Bigger is better.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would assume that they're going, and I would assume, and this could just be my personal ignorance, is that when you like there are absolutely places that need a like domain specific model or one
Okay.
that has never been, let's just say, never been connected to the internet. Some places that, you and I both know here in the DC metro area that I'm sure they are looking at things like this. Whether it's folks here in McLean, up in Maryland, some folks over in Bethesda. I'm sure there are some of them, but like also I would think that some of these folks like elite, like the legal space, right? Where, or, and one of the things that I worry about with my background in mental health also, or my business ventures in mental health as well, is like you start thinking about healthcare and healthcare concerns,
Yeah.
and HIPAA and potential HIPAA violations. But then, yeah, I would assume that there are places where some domain specific is going to be helpful. Um, but I still wonder why, like, can you get a local version of some of these larger models
Yeah.
and never have them connected to the internet and then feed your own training data into them? Is that a solution, or is it like, do these places need to build them from the ground up? But
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. No, there's a very vibrant open source community there. I mean, you could go to Hugging Face right
mhm,
now, and there are hundreds of models available for you to download. Many of those models are available. Open source. Some of the open source models are open source with like weird caveats, so you have to kind of like dig in to the different licensing agreements on these models. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. So in those scenarios, yeah, I mean, you're going to have corporate data, sensitive data that you never want on a server at Microsoft or Open Google, OpenAI, et cetera. I think the government specifically, I'm sure there are going to be language models that are going to be available on I think it's GovCloud. I
mhm,
know there are like these clouds that are
yeah,
available just to the government.
mhm,
Probably like classified versions of those as well. And yeah, you could certainly train very domain specific models. I guess I would just caution in two directions. One is like the very domain specific models is what we've had historically in natural language processing. Like before scaling laws and before really transformers, what we had were these very like domain specific boutique kind of data sets, and we trained then we would train a machine learning model to do something with that data. Maybe it was an RNN or an LSTM, and they didn't perform very well. And part of the reason they didn't perform is because, any domain still is kind of situated within a much larger domain, which is like all human knowledge. And so to some degree, you want your domain to fit into a larger model that has kind of like general knowledge of other, even if they're ancillary kind of
Hmm.
topics. But the other aspect that's important when evaluating these models is you don't want to go too small. Like there's certainly um, there's certainly a limit below which language models just can't do certain things.
Hmm.
Planning and reasoning, which is always kind of a challenge, I think, with language models because they're not trained to plan things out or to necessarily reason, um, is totally absent below like 7 billion or 13 billion parameters. And so, even though the inference is really favorable, like super cheap on
Hmm.
really small models, you don't want to go so low that you miss out on like the capabilities of a model's ability to like plan and reason.
Hmm.
So there are always like these effectively trade-offs, right? Like when
Yeah.
evaluating the size of the model versus the kind of performance that you seek in the specific domain that you operate in.
Yeah. How could you train a model to reason or to plan?
I think that's what everybody's asking right now. Yeah.
Okay.
They're good at coming up with approximations of plans and
Hmm.
approximate reasoning.
Hmm.
Um, they're not, I mean, they certainly don't have the rigor that humans have when they're kind of like reasoning through a problem. There are some mitigation strategies, chain of thought. There are advanced prompting strategies like chain of thought, that allow models to plan out basically how they're going to respond before they respond, and that generally improves performance. Agents generally improve performance with respect to reasoning, effectively because they're getting feedback from other tools.
Hmm.
Say they're compiling code, they're getting feedback from the compiler, whether it compiled or not, and they're using that information to update. And so there are strategies, I think, that there are also, maybe you'd have like an external planning model that could give the model some guidance on how to plan or how to reason through a problem. But they're all preliminary, I think, at this point. There's no, you can maybe even train it with intermediate steps or fine tune a model with intermediate steps. But
Hmm.
right now, um, yeah, I think that's what people are looking for. Many people are looking to build products that are better at planning and reasoning.
Hmm. Yeah. No, and I think it's a fascinating thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what are some of the barriers to developing that?
Um, well, I think it's a congenital defect of models. Like these models are designed to predict the next token in a sequence.
Hmm.
They're not designed to create plans, like comprehensive plans or like a 14-day itinerary across Europe. Going back to the point we made earlier about language models not knowing exactly how they're going to finish their generation kind of underscores some of the complications with planning and reasoning. Uh,
Hmm.
but so I think that's just a congenital defect.
Okay.
You could, like I was saying earlier, you could maybe tune them um, to understand not just inputs and outputs, but maybe inputs, a bunch of intermediate steps, and then outputs.
Hmm.
Um, but I think they're all provisional. Like there are dozens of different strategies that people are taking to improve their performance and reasoning,
Hmm.
and the jury's still out on I think which one is going to be the best.
Hmm. Yeah.
So we'll see. It's also complicated by the training data itself. I think ironically is that they're trained to predict the next token, but they're specifically trained to predict the next token in their training data, right?
Hmm.
Unless they're generalizing. Um, but what that means is that like your prompt isn't the only thing determining the behavior of a language model, it's also the training data. And so there are a handful of like canonical examples at this point of like asking a language model, um, like I've got a goat, a wolf, and a head of cabbage, and I need to take them across a river, and people are creating like variants of these things. And the language model is like if you eliminate the cabbage and you add, you eliminate the cabbage and the goat, and you just have the wolf, and the question is like, how do I get the wolf across a river? The language model, instead of saying, oh, get in the boat with the wolf and go across the river, like the
Hmm.
most obvious plan
Hmm.
is it's kind of like subverted because the language model understands like this canonical example of there also being a head of cabbage
Hmm.
and sheep. So it will come up with some crazy contrived scenario or plan where it's like take the wolf across the river, drop him off, go back to the other side of the river,
Hmm.
pick up a cabbage, which was never part of the equation, take that. And so it's trying to solve the problem as it knows it in the training data, which, paradoxically complicates things. So it's a tough problem right now. I think it'll be interesting. I'm curious on this point myself.
No, I am as well. It's fascinating to see kind of how the next step could, next
Yeah.
step would be. I was actually talking to a friend of mine about this last night, and talking about how, I was talking, he is not as, let's just say, technically proficient as I am, and I'm not as much as you are. But you think, I was explaining chat GPT and LLMs to him at a very high level. And it's interesting. I don't know how I just thought of it, but I was thinking about something you had said a little earlier about how it's new and it's different. I also feel like this is very familiar. I feel like, because I feel like right now we're at really like the beginning of language models, and whether large, domain specific, what have you, AI in general. And they feel kind of like the way the internet felt 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, where it was all new. Nothing was like really like now. Like, if you wanted to make a website, you'd need to learn how to code, right? Now
Yeah.
you don't need to. You don't need that. There's all these tools out there to do it. Every single thing you Google now, or you search now on the internet, there is a sponsor. There's a bunch of sponsored answers. There's like, they figured out how to monetize that. They had, and to your point earlier about, they haven't figured out how to monetize this yet. I think a lot of people have, but like not to the scale that like internet search has been monetized.
Yeah, right.
And so it feels like it's new and it's different, but it feels very like familiar to me, because it's like that's the internet I grew up with, was, the quote unquote wild west of the internet, where you could, yeah, like there were no safe browsers or anything like that, or nothing. It was just, you just found some stuff. It's like, what is this? And it was, and so what do you think, like, understanding like that, what do you think the time frame is for, you know, capitalism to destroy this too? That's probably not the best
Too
way to
late.
put it. Too late.
No, I have no idea.
Because
Yeah,
it's only a matter of time before there's a sponsored answer on ChatGPT.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. Well, it took Google, um, I mean, think about that timeline. Google's 20 years old, and for the last 5 years, I've certainly know, especially over the last 5 years, that the performance of Google search has not been it hasn't been great. It has been popular, like it is being increasingly populated with
Hmm.
sponsored links that I often click on in frustration because I'm used to like this first thing being the most useful thing.
Hmm.
And now like the whole page is filled with sponsored links. Most of the links are SEO optimized, so they're shit too. Like they're not, even when they're not sponsored, they're not giving you much of an answer anyway. It's just
Hmm.
clickbait. And yeah, I think I think using the internet has grown more and more difficult over the last several years, and why I find myself using ChatGPT for a lot of like
Yep.
search questions that I used to use Google search for. And yeah, does that mean that the technology we'll be using in 5 years is going to look the same way? I don't think so. I think the what we're using today, I think there's always going to be a version of this which is maybe replaces search engines, but
Yeah.
but
I,
I think it's also I think there are also going to be a lot more products where you don't even know it's a language model, like they're working in the background and
mhm,
you're just getting kind of like the result of the collaboration of a bunch of different language models working on a problem. I
mhm,
think um I think the what would you call it? The kind of like search version of it is like the most obvious use case, just because we're kind of familiar with search already, and
mhm,
it's like the most obvious place to start. I think that long term, you're going to see a lot of like native developments that are really taking advantage of language models. Um, and I think that's where you're going to see kind of like this takeoff
mhm.
uh, of the technology and the adoption.
Yeah, no, I think so on the search thing, I think you're right. The way I've been describing it to people is the difference. Like Google is querying the internet, ChatGPT is talking to the internet. And you're able to get like bet in my opinion, a lot of the time now you're able to get better results faster using a language model.
For
And
sure.
it like I don't have to dig to answer a question anymore or answer the specific question I need. Right. I can just go in and ask specifically what is this and anything and it will come up with an answer for me and then it's up to me to verify it, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Right. And so instead of fetching individual pages, which is what search does now, language models are looking across all pages, kind of like learning those linguistic features, but also like learning, I guess, learning concepts across all of those pages too, and giving you a like comprehensive overview of like or a snapshot of like all those different pages. It's definitely a lot better than using search today. And that's why I'm a little mystified when people are like, oh, it's got no value. Sure, it doesn't give you citations. You don't know how reputable the site is that it got that
Hmm.
information. But you're already seeing, like, if you enable web browsing inside of ChatGPT, for example, you said you use ChatGPT,
Hmm.
like it will give you a couple of references, like, hey, I found it on this page. I think that's just the start of it. I
I
think
agree.
over time, you're going to see it grounded like more heavily on individual web pages. And that may be like an advertising sort of revenue model similar to Google, like how Google search has been able to monetize search that these companies end up using, and it's going to be better for the user. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
but better for the user, I think, is more like the most salient point. Some people kind of get bogged down in these esoteric sort of debates about the technology, and I don't know. Yeah,
Hmm.
just delete that last part from in post production.
See what I can do, man. I'll see what I can do. What how do you think it's going to um and we've touched on this a little bit. Um but a lot of people, and I think a lot of people are, feel this way because of some movies that came out in the 80s, think that AI poses an existential risk to us as a civilization. What are your thoughts on that? And where are the biggest flaws do you think in a lot of this logic?
Yeah, I actually was just in kind of a LinkedIn battle with people. I posted something to LinkedIn today. Today's the 5th.
Hmm.
Um, and it was about there have been a series of articles written over the last couple of months that have been declaring that the AI doomer movement is dead. And it is certainly something I hope is true. I doubt it is true, but the doomer movement is it's the contingent of AI that focuses on the existential threats. And they tend to focus on like these goofy takeoff scenarios. Like the models will suddenly become intelligent and they're going to recursively self-improve, and then they're going to like subjugate all of humanity. And
Mhm.
or they're going to do something goofy, like they're going to um, I don't know if you're familiar with like Nick Bostrom's um, concept of the paperclip maximizer, but you know they're going to acquire all all resources on Earth and allocate them to creating paperclips. And they're just like these unhinged scenarios that are
Mhm.
predicated on like clever rhetorical tricks and thought experiments. And what I hate about them is there are real risks. And we were talking offline earlier about the risk to social media, and like that risk, like nobody, no, you know, when with the advent of social media, many people kind of hailed it as a way where we could like get together and collaborate and stay close to loved ones and companions and coworkers and everything else. Um, what we overlooked were the risks that were much more subtle and accumulated, like they accumulated over a long period of time, and we didn't do anything about them. Like, I think what's important to understand about technology is there's not like this Big Bang scenario where suddenly it's an existential threat to all of humanity. What an invention is it's slow, it's methodical, it's incremental, and like whatever risks there are, they accumulate over a long period of time. And that's the danger, is that whatever risk, and there are going to be risks with
Mhm.
any new technology. Generative technology is going to be no exception. But they're going to be subtle. It's not going to be some robot that starts making paper clips
Mhm.
infinitely. And so what I hate about this doomer conversation is, again, it's predicated on thought experiments. So it's not predicated on any real risks that we could talk about today or we could monitor. What I
Mhm.
hope we do, which I don't think we did with social media, is that we try to identify some potential risks and we keep measuring those risks, right? Like let's measure twice, let's measure twice and cut once.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think that's going to be important for public policy and any potential regulations. And we need not get distracted by these like doomer scenarios that are predicated on, you know, fantastic kind of thought experiments.
Yeah, man. And I think that first, it's ridiculous that AI is going to make all the make robots, use resources to make all the paper clips. We
Yeah.
already know Microsoft made the best paper clip. And
Clippy.
yeah, man, that's my man Clippy. Yeah, man, Clippy's amazing. I love Clippy. But in all seriousness, I think it's fascinating to look at some of these, it's fascinating to look at the technology waves of the past and like do lessons learned on them. And actually, I don't know if you saw this, but like 2 or 3 months ago, the Surgeon General just released an article. He put an article out, and I think it was the New York Times, um, calling for a Surgeon General's warning being added to social media the way it has been added to cigarettes and like tobacco products and I assume alcohol. I don't know, other things as well because of the very real mental health risks that children have. Children experience by being on a platform that is designed to keep you engaged and designed to give you dopamine hits and keep you engaged. And like, you want to talk about damage in AI, like I would assume that a lot of those algorithms that have been written, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, who's the best, I mean, all of that is, a different form, not necessarily generative, but it is designed to manipulate your brain chemistry for their profit.
Yep.
And it's as somebody who has a young child, it's terrifying when you start thinking about how some of that, how it could work and what the potential downsides of this are. Um but I don't think, using all the world's resources making paper clips is one.
Yeah, it's it's frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the way, yeah, I agree with you. The way I've been thinking about the risk is the whole doomer scenarios, I think are, we could probably dismiss those. There's no evidence. Like these models were never designed to acquire consciousness or awareness. They don't understand anything that they're doing. Like all the prerequisites for like these takeoff scenarios are just absent. And we always need to keep in mind like these models were designed for a very specific task. In this
Mhm.
case, predicting the next word in a sequence. And it's important to always remember that because it's hard for technology to then be something totally different, which is like, oh, well, it poses some existential risk because of this. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, that isn't what the model is. It was never designed to do that. And so you've got to be a bit credulous to like accept a lot of these doomer scenarios. That's not to say that there are no risks, however. And I think what we're doing right now is we're kind of like conflating some of these like existential threats with all threats. And my worry is that we're going to overreact
Mhm.
and we're going to regulate the technology and it's not going to be on anything real. And there's kind of like this temporal kind of dynamic happening, I think, with risk is where similar to Amara's law. I don't know if you're familiar with
Mhm.
Amara's law, where we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short run and underestimate. I think there's something from a risk perspective that's equivalent where we might be overestimating the risk in the short term and we're going to underestimate the risk in the long term. Um, and that I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about the risk. It's not it's that the risk today, we don't know what the risk today is. And we certainly we can't reliably say that it's based on these existential kind of scenarios. But long term, we shouldn't ignore the risks either because
Mhm.
they're going to be real and they're going to accumulate and they're going to be subtle and we're going to miss them potentially while we're
Mhm.
like distracted over here.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely. What do I mean, you touched on this a moment ago around like regulation and over regulating some of this. What role do you think government should play in, how much regulation is the right amount in your opinion, and kind of where should that line be?
yeah. I don't know. We certainly we dedicated an entire chapter to the book
Mhm.
on the legal landscape, the regulatory landscape, like what is happening today in Europe, specifically in Europe and the United States. We give a couple of examples of states, California, obviously New York, Illinois. They're all very active in the regulatory space. I haven't seen any regulations that I thought were especially good just because it is so early. And I don't know if this technology even knows what it wants to be yet. I
Mhm.
think there are some areas of the technology that are going to be um, I think there are a bunch of legal cases right now that are looking at copyright infringement, and I think those are going to be very important. But that's not regulation. Like we already have a lot of laws on the books that prevent organizations from using these technologies in ways that violate people's privacy or discriminate against people or, copyright infringement. Now, it's going to be determined whether, it's fair use to use internet that's data that's on the internet to train language models. I'm curious to how that's going to shake out.
Yeah.
But regulations, I think it's still a little too early. And you've seen some of the pushback with SB 1047, which
Mhm.
is California's AI bill. And like that's it's nebulous and it's almost implying kind of like a bunch of these doomer scenarios. The closest they get to kind of codifying risk is associated with flops. So like the number of operations that that occur during training and it's not obvious how that relates to any specific risk. And
Mhm.
so I think these many of the regulations, I mean, they all kind of share a similar characteristic, which is they don't talk about specific risks.
Hmm.
And that's my problem. It's regulating today on these vague concepts of risk rather than specific risk. And we
Yeah.
may just need another year or two to figure out, what are these models and how are they going to be used and where are the risky applications, and then talk about legislation or
Mhm.
regulation.
Yeah. No, and I agree with you. I think that like, yeah, an allegory I think that could be applicable here is, you look at our Constitution, right? Versus constitutions that have been written since ours was written, in late 1700s. I forget the exact year that it was written. But you look at like one of the things that a lot of legal scholars in my from what I've read say that's good about good about this our Constitution is that um we it's broad and vague in a lot of ways, and it leaves a lot of room for interpretation as
Mhm.
times change versus a lot of specifics. And so I think there could be some stuff, there could be some room for some guidelines now. But you look at, I think that I think that, something that somebody mentioned on an earlier episode of my podcast of robots and red tape was about about Congress and how Congress is taking it seriously and how they have, I think, established a working group, which is abnormal. And the working group has brought a lot of folks in who are experts, and they're like actively listening and having conversations around it before you act. And I am inclined to agree that that's a great approach where, all right, let's sit down, let's talk to experts, let's gather a bunch of data and try to figure out what the best way forward could be. With like, but let's not make a knee-jerk reaction decision
Mhm.
based on something that we're scared of.
Yeah.
uh, I think that like private companies shouldn't be encouraged to use facial recognition software as part of as in their tools like that. Um, just because I have privacy concerns around that. Like I don't need companies who are hooked into cameras knowing where I am and what I'm doing. Like, but at the same time, I understand that there's absolutely a great use case for that in places like train stations and airports, right? As long as the positive identification rate is good enough and consistent, I think, across people that look different and genders and skin tones and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
um but I think there's a long way to go for a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, but in that scenario, you're talking about something very specific.
Mhm.
And that's I think that's what's often absent from these discussions is that it tends to be, yeah, it tends to be kind of abstract, and anything that starts with, well, there's a thought experiment. I mean, that to me, that kind of thing should just be precluded from any serious discussion
Mhm.
about public policy, or regulations, or even like a serious risk calculation. Because if you're
Yep.
talking about existential threat, you've got to talk about, well, help me, if you want me to take you seriously, help me understand where that perspective is coming from,
Mhm.
because it doesn't exist today.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, our problem isn't, I think long term, our problem isn't going to be that any of these algorithms are going to be smart. It's going to be, they're going to be all over the place and they're going to be stupid. And uh,
Well, I mean, the content out on the internet that's gonna be training them, so,
yeah,
and one of my favorite quotes of all time is, George Carlin. I mean, he said, think about how smart the average person is, right?
half the people
Half
are, yeah,
half of them are dumber than that.
yeah, yeah.
It's just like, man, that's a real poignant way to put that, sir. But man, as we start looking forward, right? I know we've touched on this a couple of different times in a couple of different places, but as you think go forward over the next 5 years, 10 years, first, where do you think like how far out is it too difficult to predict what's going to happen? But second, where do you see a lot of these technologies evolving to? And and how do you see something like, like a chat GPT impacting us on a day-to-day basis over the next decade?
I have no idea.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we could probably project some scaling laws out into the future. I think you're going to see a couple more iterations of increasingly larger models with more data, trained on more data, and I think you're going to see. I think there are going to be some diminishing returns. I think we're kind of asymptotically approaching perhaps the limits of these models, but I think the financial incentives are too large. We're going to squeeze everything we can out of scaling laws. I think after that, you're going to see the models. I think really right now, not many organizations have focused on data quality. I think then we're going to shift into this. Okay, we've kind of figured out the ceiling as it relates to scale. Let's start tinkering with data quality. And I think that could go on for a really long time. And so I think you'll see model improvement over the next 10 years. They're going to get better.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, they're not going to get better in a way, where a lot of these like takeoff scenarios where they're going to start to exponentially improve. None of that's going to happen. It's going to be linear. It's going to be pragmatic. It's going to be incremental. And I think people are going to start to figure out, these models, how they work, what complementary technologies are required. And we're going to start seeing more companies building products with these tools.
Mhm.
And it's going to slowly integrate into our lives, but it's not going to be this big boom. There's not going to be an intelligence explosion. So what we see today, I think is going to look pretty similar to what we're going to see in a year.
Mhm.
And now projecting that out past a few years, I think is always a little tricky. But I think it's just going to be, you know, I don't know. Honestly, I'm a little leery to say, only because I think beyond the next few years with scale is people are going to think there's always this jump. Like early internet, we're using internet early as an analogy. Like the early internet, nobody knew what the internet was. There's the famous like Good Day America clip where they're like, what is that sign? Like, what is that at sign? Like, what am I supposed to do with the internet? Is it to
Mhm.
send mail? Like people just didn't know what to do with it. We're
Yeah.
not, I think we're a little past that with language models.
Mhm.
There are a lot of users. I think people are getting comfortable with the technology. They're figuring out how to use it. But even like during the .com boom in the late 90s, what did we really do? Like we created a bunch of businesses that existed in the real world and we put them on the internet. I think with language models, you're going to see that. I think you're going to see language models that align with specific jobs. You already see that kind of in the Copilot model, where you
Mhm.
have models that align with software developers. I think you're going to see models that align with security analysts. Like this very skeuomorphic type of adoption strategy, I think is going to exist in the next few years. The same during that same time, we're going to figure out scaling. We're going to figure out better data quality. We're going to build complementary technologies. Beyond that, we're going to start to figure out how to use the technology in novel ways, not specifically like, oh, I'm going to create a co-pilot for everybody in my business, but now like, how can we use these things in new ways,
Mhm.
novel, native ways that complement the technology the most? And I think that's where it gets interesting.
Mhm.
But I don't know what that looks like today.
Yeah. What I'm pretty sure of is, you think we're about halfway through this decade now. I think that there are companies that are going to be on the Fortune 500 list, in the AI space that are like the founders of them are in a garage somewhere right
Very,
now,
yeah.
figuring it, building something cool, right?
Yeah.
And I think that really, we're about to watch an explosion, and I think there's going to be a boom similar to the 90s .com boom of a whole lot of, and we're already seeing it, of a whole lot of people jumping into the space without the fundamental understanding of what they're doing outside of just having the buzzword of AI.
Yeah,
And then
for sure.
second,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of that
Mhm.
today.
Yeah, and then also, like, they don't have the data infrastructure in place to do anything with any of their data. And there's a lot of businesses out there that are like still running on at gmail.com domains, right? And like they'll never get there, whether they're just, aging out or what have you, where it's just not a super technical business. And but like I think that there's gonna be the big expansion, then there's gonna be the big contraction of a whole bunch of people, going belly up, and maybe the founder, you know, took a lot of money from private equity and then took all that money out, and then they just like nothing happens. And but I think that there's a lot of potential here to like improve people's day-to-day lives. And what it allow like how I use generative AI models now personally is it I don't have to write a lot of stuff from scratch anymore, right? I like not if I was writing a book by any stretch of the imagination like yourself, but like if I'm writing a blog post, I'm able to get myself 80% of the way there and only do the last 20% myself with a hands-on and making the point that I want to make. It
Yep.
frees up my brain power because that's the most finite resource we have on a day-to-day basis is our attention and brain power to do the more consequential tasks that you can't automate and frankly the stuff that like somebody like myself or somebody like you bring to an organization. Like we don't bring like our ability to tactily, to at a tactical level execute a task. That's not why people want to work with you or with me. They want to work with us because we bring a lot of strategic knowledge in, and it frees me up to do the stuff that I'm good at.
Yep.
And it frees up my time and it frees up my attention. And I think that like if we can continue to sit in that space where AI is going to do those things, I think it can add a lot of value, but it's figuring out how do you add a lot of value. Um, and I don't know if you saw the study. I forget who did it, but there was a study done on uh, productivity of employees those that use generative AI to do their job and those that don't. And the people that use AI to enhance their ability to do their job are 30 to 40% more productive than those who don't.
Yep.
So now I'm operating at 130, 140% of where I was. That just allows me to do so much more.
Yep.
But before we wrap up, man, any points you want to add?
Um, just just one dovetailing on what you were just talking about and how you kind of see maybe companies on the Fortune 500 um that you see maybe in the next couple of years, new companies, AI companies being on the Fortune 500. I think that's true. Um, and I think that's good for the United States. I think that's good for our economy. That may not happen if we sort of become enamored or entranced with like these doomer scenarios that are predicated on nothing but like rhetorical tricks and thought experiments. If we and I'm not advocating that we don't regulate, I'm just saying if we regulate too soon, we may not see that happen. And I'm a fan of regulation, just not regulation too soon. You got to figure out what the real risks are and monitor them carefully and don't forget about them.
Mhm.
And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you look at Europe, France, Britain, Germany, the top, I think it's like the top 100, maybe 200 companies, none of them have been created in the last 70 years. And I
Mm,
think that's because Europe spends a lot of time um, you know, consternating about risk and what might happen rather than let's figure out the technology and we'll come back to it. And I think the United States has benefited in this scenario.
mhm.
Like they've been more innovative over that period of time because we don't get dragged down into regulation. I think the United States also waits too long sometimes to regulate, and so hopefully we could strike the right balance this time.
Hey, I'm really hoping you're right, Rich. And
Cheers.
I really just want to thank you for coming on Robots and
Yeah,
Red.
thanks again.
This has been a lot of fun. You know, everybody, Generative Artificial Intelligence Revealed is going to be out next week. I hope you look Rich up and get a copy because it's a fascinating book, man. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.